The big thing that Souls fanboys always fall back on when it comes to the Zelda versus Souls debate is that Dark Souls has better combat. Oh, so like enemies just swinging their blade at you and you blocking them is somehow better. Forget the fact that like Zelda has so much more versatility. Forget the fact that you have so much more going on with like the weapon management and the armors and like the different weapon sets you can just switch between on the fly. The fusions, the strategies you can take. Forget that like Zelda has so much more going on, like mechanics wise, that it's not even funny. Like Dark Souls is better because it just is, okay? Like that's the narrative, right? Because that's really all it comes down to, really, when it comes to like this idea that Dark Souls is a good franchise, is this myth that it has good combat, right? Never mind the enemies all look the same and move the same way and aren't really that much of a threat to you if you just stand in place and hold your shield up, right? Never mind like the lack of real innovation in the Souls game since Demon Souls in 2008. Never mind the lack of real evolution, the real gameplay. Like, never mind how boring Dark Souls was, even back in 2011, right? Like, forget about all that. Let's just pretend that Souls is better than Zelda because we desperately need something we can hold against the big end, right? Like, oh, like it was like Dark Souls really was like the Baldur's Gate 3 of like the last decade. Because I remember when that was like a relevant talking point, when like people seriously pushed this narrative that Dark Souls had a better gameplay loop than Zelda did. Completely ignoring like Zelda's better pacing, its better environments, more uh actual puzzles, right? Better dungeon design. Like, forget all of that. Forget all of that. Like, Dark Souls is better because it's harder, right? Like, that's all it comes down to. This is a game for real gamers. Forget the fact that the game completely falls off after you get the Lord Vessel, right? Let's forget the second half of the game is garbage that nobody likes. Like, let's forget that, like, the game is only a couple of hours long if you know what you're doing, right? Like let's forget about how broken the game is once you like learn the mechanics. Let's forget about all of that and just call Dark Souls the best game ever made because we haven't got anything else. That's what it comes down to, right? These people don't acknowledge Zelda's long history. They don't acknowledge multiple titles. They don't acknowledge the evolution of the series. And they certainly don't acknowledge that Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is a better Dark Souls game than any Dark Souls game that's ever been produced, right? Like, it's crazy how much more compact, interesting, fun to play, challenging the NES Zeldas are compared to the hackneyed, played out, uninspired Dark Souls games, right? It's been the same thing over and over from Souls and their spin-off titles, right? Since its inception. But Zelda innovated itself with A Link to the Past. It innovated with Ocarina of Time. It innovated with Skyward Sword, and it innovated with Breath of the Wild, right? You know, uh, Ocarina of Time came out in 1998. Breath of the Wild came out in 2017. So that's like about like 19 years. Not even like 20 years, right? And Zelda has managed to innovate itself like twice, completely reinvent itself, right? And it's just it was an incredible experience living through that. Like playing all these games, experiencing all these stories, exploring all these worlds, getting all these combat encounters, fighting these crazy bosses. I don't regret a single moment of that. That was peak gaming for sure. Dark Souls came out in 2008, right? Well, Demon Souls came out in 2008. Elden Ring came out in 2022. So that's like what, like a 15-year gap? About, yeah, 14-year gap, almost as long, 5 years shorter. And in that amount of time, the series hasn't grown, evolved, or changed at all. All you do is avoid getting hit and hit the enemy. There's no technical complexity. The animations are stiff and asinine. They reuse enemy designs all the time. Bosses are uninspired. They have one or two attacks. They're not fun to fight. You know, there's no Dark Souls is nowhere near as innovative, as memorable, or as interesting as Zelda. The only reason it's talked about in the same breath is because people back 10 years ago were desperate to find something they can hold against Zelda. That's kind of what it comes down to. It has nothing to do with like the actual quality of the games. It has nothing to do with like the with like Zelda's like path to becoming what it is now. It had nothing to do with like people getting bored of Zelda and just falling in love with Dark Souls for being better. It had nothing to do with any of that. Like the people who love Dark Souls already hated Zelda. They were already making excuses not to play Zelda. They were already like they were already doing everything in their power to avoid Nintendo consoles and avoid Nintendo games and like pretend that Nintendo stuff is for babies, right? They were doing everything in their power to ignore all these great games that came out. And so when this game, which was directly influenced by Ocarina of Time, when this game comes out, which is kind of like Zelda, like it becomes this huge phenomenon with them. Like, oh, it's Zelda, but it's not for babies, so it's safe for me to play and look like I'm a hardcore gamer, right? Like I'm gonna have cred when I actually beat this game. Like when you take a step back and actually look at the Dark Souls phenomenon, you kind of realize that like it's not actually fun. It's not actually interesting. It's not actually engaging. It doesn't it doesn't actually challenge the player, right? You can find plenty of videos online about like what it's like fighting Gwyn at the end of Dark Souls, like where you all you have to do is just parry him twice, and you can just take him out with like no issues whatsoever. Like everything about Dark Souls is just a complete mess. That's only propped up by speedrunners and people who are just obsessed with the IP because they think it makes them look cool, right? There is no actual merit to the gameplay, to the mechanics, to like the art style, to like the engine, to the formula. Like Dark Souls is just not all that impressive. When you look at it objectively, games like Dark Souls, games like Skyrim, games like Dragon's Dogma, all of them pale in comparison to the real king of the fantasy adventure genre, The Legend of Zelda.